Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mazzoro, and today I want to continue talking about marine ecology by talking about something a little bit strange. I want to talk about chemosynthesis. Now, in your ecology lessons, either in biology or in an ecology class, you learned a lot about photosynthesis, taking light energy from the sun and turning it into food energy, glucose. You didn't learn so much about chemosynthesis. What is it? Does it even exist? A lot of people don't even know that it's a thing. Where does chemosynthesis happen in the ocean? And how does it relate to photosynthesis? What are the similarities and differences? That's what I really want to talk to you today about in this lesson. So, what's chemosynthesis? Chemosynthesis is taking inorganic chemicals and converting them into food. Not light into food, chemicals into food. But what do I mean inorganic chemicals? What does that mean? Well, inorganic chemicals are chemicals that don't contain carbon. Hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, nitrite, iron, these are all chemicals that chemosynthetic organisms can use to make food or glucose. Hydrogen sulfide is a poison. It's a rotten egg smell. It's the active ingredient in rotten eggs. It's something that's actually released at the bottom of the ocean in hydrothermal vents. So is ammonia or ammonium, an ion that's so toxic it actually sterilizes things. It's the reason why it's used in a lot of cleaners. Nitrite is actually even more toxic than ammonia, and it's one of the chemicals also released in volcanoes. And could also be iron. Something as benign as iron that's throughout the ocean as well as in mud. Iron can be used and taken by these chemosynthetic organisms, and some of the chemical energy can be converted out of that iron and into food. So, how does it relate to chemosynthesis? Or how does photosynthesis relate to chemosynthesis? Well, photosynthesis, if you remember, starts by absorbing CO2 and H2O, and it converts those two molecules through light energy into glucose or sugar, C6H12O6, and oxygen. CO2 and water go in, glucose and oxygen go out. That's photosynthesis. Chemosynthesis is the same but different. In chemosynthesis, oxygen is actually a starting product along with CO2. Glucose still comes out, but the big difference is that inorganicals come in and oxidized chemicals come out. So what does that mean? Well, let's go back to our ones before. If a chemosynthetic organism absorbs hydrogen sulfide or rotten egg smell from a volcano or from a rotting organism, it's going to combine that with oxygen and turn that hydrogen sulfide into sulfur dioxide, turn H2S into SO2. By doing that, it actually gets some energy, which it uses to make glucose from CO2. Same thing's true of ammonia, right? Ammonia goes in, nitrite goes out, or nitrite goes in and nitrate goes out. In both cases, those molecules are combined with oxygen to produce an oxidized molecule. And some of that energy that bacteria or that archaea get from oxidizing those molecules, they use to turn CO2 into C6H12O6 or glucose. Iron, same idea. Iron goes in, rust. Iron oxide goes out. CO2 and O2 go in, C6H12O6 go out. So this is chemosynthesis. Inorganic chemical goes in, oxidized chemical goes out. O2 and CO2 go in, glucose comes out. Now the organism is actually using the energy it's getting from oxidizing a chemical to make glucose, not the energy it's getting from light to make glucose like plants and algae do in photosynthesis. So where does this happen? What types of organisms actually perform chemosynthesis? Well, if chemosynthesis itself wasn't weird enough for you, I have to now introduce you to what is in fact probably a new category of life. Bacteria are some of the organisms that do chemosynthesis. They're prokaryotic organisms that lack a nucleus. They're single cellular and they do chemosynthesize. But there are other organisms called archaea. Archaea also chemosynthesize. Archaea also lack a nucleus like bacteria, but strange as it is, they're not really bacteria. In fact, they're more closely related to organisms that have a nucleus than organisms that don't. Archaea are also often known as extremophiles. They live in very, very hot or extreme environments, like very hot temperatures or cold temperatures, very acidic environments. There's archaea that live inside concentrated sulfuric acid in water that's hot enough to melt lead and that is 10,000 times the pressure of surface. They live in water that's so salty it can basically dehydrate any other organism on Earth. And this is where that archaea, those prokaryotic organisms, call home, and some of them actually chemosynthesize in those environments. In general, chemosynthesis happens by prokaryotic organisms, but unfortunately, aside from bacteria, that also means these other guys, archaea, these bacteria-like creatures. Where does it happen? Okay, well, that's easy. I've talked a lot about it happening at the bottom of the ocean where there's no photosynthesis because there's no light, but it also happens at the top. It happens in mud often. Why? Well, there's a lot of stuff in mud. Mud is very fine. It traps a lot of chemicals, and some of those chemicals can be used by bacteria or archaea and converted into glucose. Mainly, though, it does happen in the ocean in hydrothermal vents, these deep-sea hot springs. And basically, those deep-sea hot springs spew out superheated water, water that can melt lead, 400 degrees Celsius. And because that water is so hot and under so much pressure, along with that water comes chemicals, tiny little molecules that archaea and bacteria down there can use to make food, glucose, sugar, just like you put in your coffee. Only this is made in a volcano and water hot enough to melt lead. So, general comparisons, right? How do organisms get the energy in chemosynthesis and photosynthesis? Well, in chemosynthesis, the energy comes from chemicals. Photosynthesis, the energy comes from light. Chemicals are used to make food energy in chemosynthesis. Light is used to make food energy in photosynthesis. What types of organisms do it? In chemosynthesis, it's organisms without a nucleus. Prokaryotic organisms, bacteria, and archaea. In photosynthesis, it could be plants, it could be algae, or it could be photosynthetic bacteria like cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. What kind of food is produced? In both cases, sugar is being produced, but what's also released is oxidized chemicals in chemosynthesis. In photosynthesis, all that's released is oxygen. In chemosynthesis, a chemical goes in and the oxidized chemical goes out. In photosynthesis, light and water go in and sugar and oxygen go out. So that's it for our kind of primer on chemosynthesis. It can get a lot more complicated than that, but that's really all I need you to understand. What is it? It's the process of taking chemicals, oxidizing them, and using the energy an organism gets from oxidizing that chemical to make sugar or food. Where does it happen? It happens in mud, and it also happens at the bottom of the ocean. Wherever there's chemicals, there's probably going to be at least some chemosynthesis by chemosynthetic organisms like archaea or bacteria. And what are the similarities and differences between chemosynthesis and photosynthesis? Well, aside from the fact that they both make sugar, they're both types of primary production. They happen in different places. One uses light, the other uses chemicals. One's done by archaea, the other one's done by bacteria and archaea and other organisms, plants and algae. So there are some similarities. Sugar is what comes out and some of the organisms that do them. But there's aside from that, they are very, very different processes. So that's it. That's really all I wanted you to understand in terms of chemosynthesis and photosynthesis and the differences between them. The next lesson is we're going to start not talking about chemosynthetic organisms, but we're going to start talking about all of our photosynthetic organisms in the ocean.